Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, nations of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO alliance, have stood by Ukraine. They've shown support in various ways, with many sending vital arms packages to the country, helping it to fend off repeated Russian attacks. However, despite the pleas of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine has not been allowed to join the alliance and enjoy all the benefits membership brings. But that's going to change. At a recent summit involving multiple key European leaders, as well as the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, leaders strongly reiterated their support for Ukraine's future in NATO, reaffirming that the country will eventually join the alliance despite any objections from Russian President Vladimir Putin. The news came from the Bucharest 9 and Northern European Summit in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius on June 2nd. Those in attendance included leaders from several Northern European nations like Sweden and Finland, as well as representatives from all 9 members of the Bucharest 9 or B9 organization. B9 formed in 2015 in Bucharest, Romania, unifying 9 member nations: Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania and Slovakia. Its formation was a response to perceived Russian aggression at the time, as Russia had, in 2014, forcefully taken control of Crimea, annexing it from Ukraine. Understandably, the B9 nations, all of which are geographically and historically close to Russia, were concerned that their territory could be targeted in the future, so decided to join forces, hosting regular meetings, sharing information, and so on. This particular summit was organized to allow the B9 and Northern European nations to align their respective security positions, strengthen cooperation along the eastern flank of NATO, and talk about how they might continue supporting and aiding Ukraine ahead of the upcoming NATO summit, scheduled to take place at The Hague from June 24 to 26. President Zelensky was also in attendance, and a large part of the discussions focused on Ukraine and its future. After hearing from Zelensky and discussing with one another, the B9 and Northern European leaders were in complete agreement. They pledged to continue political, military, economic and humanitarian aid to Ukraine with a long-term aim of securing peace in the region. The summit chairs, including the President of the Republic of Lithuania, Gitanas Nausėda, President of the Republic of Poland, Andrzej Duda, and President of Romania, Nicolae Dan, all later shared a detailed statement outlining what was discussed during the meeting and what conclusions the various leaders came to. The statement repeatedly highlighted the ever-present threat that Russia poses and the importance of a strong and unified NATO pushback against Putin. We met today at a pivotal moment when the security environment continues to deteriorate as Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine claims lives, causes civilian suffering, and violates international norms and agreements. Russia remains the most significant long-term and direct threat to Euro-Atlantic security, and NATO must further adapt its approach towards Russia. The alliance must be prepared for all possible contingencies. The statement went on to discuss the power and the importance of the NATO alliance, and the shared responsibility of its members to protect one another and promote peace across the world. It also highlighted the attending members' commitments to the cause, noting that they were all gradually moving towards the target of spending a minimum of 5% of their respective GDPs on defense and defense-related investments, as well as pushing for a strong transatlantic defense industry with faster production, smarter procurement, and more international collaboration. The statement also condemned Russia's aggression, while also calling out several of the countries that have supported the Kremlin's cause, like Iran, China, Belarus, and North Korea. Most importantly, it once more reaffirmed all of the nations' shared support for Ukraine. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Territorial integrity is a fundamental and irreplaceable principle of international law, which must be respected and always protected. We reaffirm that the security of Ukraine is an integral part of the security of the Euro-Atlantic region. We will continue our political, military, economic, and humanitarian support to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to reach a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. That's all great news for Ukraine, but it wasn't the most important statement to emerge from the summit. No, that statement came from NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte when asked if Ukraine should become part of NATO by 2030. he was unequivocal in his response.
Well, you know that when it comes to Ukraine, in Washington, there was a clear commitment by all 32 allies that there is an irreversible path for Ukraine to come into NATO. Not with an end date, not understanding this as part of a peace settlement, but clearly as a longer-term commitment by all 32 allies. And we are building that bridge as we speak, with the command in Wiesbaden, with in Poland, JTEC, which is capturing all the lessons, and of course all the other cooperation ongoing between NATO countries and Ukraine.
A clear statement, and one that should send shockwaves throughout the Kremlin, right to the desk of Russian President Vladimir Putin himself. Putin has consistently argued against NATO membership for Ukraine, as Russia is deeply concerned about the idea of having NATO forces so close to its borders. He's even claimed that the threat of NATO expansion was one of the primary reasons behind the Ukraine invasion itself. Indeed, in February 2022, weeks before the invasion began, Putin gave a speech warning of the risks of Ukraine becoming a NATO member. In that speech, he stated, "Do you understand it or not, that if Ukraine joins NATO and attempts to bring Crimea back by military means, the European countries will be automatically pulled into a war conflict with Russia? Of course, NATO's and Russia's potentials are incomparable. We understand it. But we also understand that Russia is one of the leading nuclear states, and by some modern components, it even outperforms many. There will be no winners, and you'll be pulled into this conflict against your will." Additionally, ever since the idea of peace talks or a possible ceasefire in the war has been brought up, Putin and other Kremlin officials have repeatedly demanded that Ukraine be barred from joining the NATO alliance. In June 2024, for example, President Putin said that Russia was offering a concrete, real peace proposal to Kyiv. In that proposal, Putin outlined his terms. As soon as Kyiv agrees to these conditions, agrees to completely withdraw its troops from the DPR, LPR, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and actually launches this process, we're ready to start negotiations without delay. I repeat, our principal position is as follows: the neutral, non-aligned, non-nuclear status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification. Putin has doubled down on those demands in recent days and weeks. One Russian official stated that Putin is ready to make peace, but not at any price. Allegedly, the Russian president wants a written pledge from major Western nations to not enlarge the NATO alliance any further eastwards towards Russia. That would effectively rule out NATO membership for Ukraine, as well as other nations that have shown interest in joining the alliance, such as Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Putin also is said to want Ukraine to be essentially declared a neutral state, without any alignment to Western nations like the US or parts of Western Europe, so that it cannot be turned against Russia in any way moving forward. It's easy to imagine why Putin is making these demands. Should Ukraine ultimately join NATO, it would represent a massive failure in the story of his leadership so far, as well as bringing the alliance, which he sees as one of, if not the biggest threat to Russia's future, even closer to his borders. With Sweden and Finland recently joining NATO, the former in March 2024 and the latter in April 2023, the alliance has been creeping ever closer to Russia, slowly putting pressure on the Kremlin and limiting any possible routes of invasion or territorial gains it might try to make in the future. It seems, for the time being, that Russia will not acquiesce to any peace deals unless Ukraine's NATO membership is completely off the table. But based on Mark Rutte's words, NATO is not going to back down on this. Ukraine will be part of the alliance. It's no longer a case of if it will happen, but when. And the country has already been waiting quite some time. In fact, it was way back in 2008 at the Bucharest summit that NATO leaders made the decision that Ukraine would eventually become a member of the alliance. And perhaps that was the very moment that Putin started to put his plans into action, eventually annexing Crimea in 2014 before launching the full-scale invasion in 2022. It's not uncommon for the process of a country joining NATO to take several years, though the timing varies massively from country to country. In the case of Finland and Sweden, for instance, they both applied to join NATO on the same day, 18th of May 2022. Allied leaders agreed to invite both countries into the alliance mere months later, in June 2022, and they were both in the alliance within 2 years. In other cases, it takes much longer. Montenegro, for example, was first invited to NATO's Membership Action Plan (MAP) in 2009. It began accession talks at the end of 2015, signed the accession protocol in 2016, and officially became a member in 2017. So the whole process took around 8 years. The Republic of Macedonia, meanwhile, had to wait over 2 decades to join the alliance. It joined the MAP in 1999, but didn't begin accession talks with NATO leaders until 2018, and eventually became a fully fledged NATO member in 2020. So there's no telling exactly how long it might take until Ukraine is granted NATO status. It's very likely that any accession talks and agreements will not take place until after the war is over, or at least until a ceasefire of some sort has been established. Still, that hasn't stopped the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, pushing to accelerate the process. In fact, back in 2022, not long after the invasion began, Ukraine submitted a request for an accelerated entry of Ukraine into NATO. At the time, Zelensky argued that Ukraine had already demonstrated it could completely comply with NATO rules and values, and that it should be allowed to follow in the footsteps of countries like Finland and Sweden, which both enjoyed relatively speedy access to the alliance. Zelensky has even gone as far as saying he will step down as president of Ukraine if it means that the country can be allowed into NATO. These comments came in February of 2025, around 3 years after the war began, and in the wake of comments from US President Donald Trump, who had earlier accused Zelensky of being a dictator without elections. Zelensky said, "If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I'm ready. I can trade it for NATO membership if there are such conditions." This demonstrates just how desperate and eager Ukraine is to be a part of the alliance, so Zelensky and his people will surely be happy to hear the recent statements from the Vilnius summit. And it's no exaggeration at all to say that NATO membership would be a game changer for Ukraine. The country would instantly enjoy a whole host of new benefits, protections, and much stronger connections with allies across the Western world. Arguably, the most important of those benefits is NATO's Article 5, which states, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area." So in a nutshell, it means that any attack on any NATO member is seen as an attack on the entire alliance, and the entire alliance will respond in full. So, had Ukraine already been in NATO at the time of Russia's invasion in February 2022, it would have been seen as war on NATO, and every member from the US to the UK, France, Germany, and all of the other allied nations would retaliate, fighting side by side with Ukraine as a collective force to counter Russia's aggression. Indeed, with the colossal amounts of firepower on the NATO side, led by the world's most powerful military force, the United States, Russia would likely have never even contemplated the idea of invading Ukraine in the first place, despite President Putin's bluster and boasting. The truth of the matter is that Russia is no match for NATO. Even at a time when Russia has ramped up military recruitment, even going as far as offering up to $40,000 payments to those who joined the fight, and plans to expand its army up to 1.5 million active duty members, it's a comparatively small force when put side by side with NATO, which can call on more than 3.4 million active soldiers, as well as millions more across its member states should they be needed. Recent statistics also show that NATO would effectively dominate Russia in almost any field of combat. In the skies, for example, NATO boasts around more than 22,000 aircraft, which dwarfs Russia's tally of just under 4,300. NATO has far more fighters, interceptors, transport aircraft, tanker aircraft and helicopters than Russia could ever muster, and would easily overwhelm the Russian aerial forces, especially with the aid of the US Air Force, which has the fastest, stealthiest and most powerful fighter jets and bombers on the planet. At sea too, NATO wins outright. It has over 1,100 military ships to call on in total, more than double Russia's total of 419. It has 16 aircraft carriers, while Russia has just one, along with more than 10 times more destroyers and frigates, plus higher numbers of patrol boats, submarines and minesweepers. On the ground, meanwhile, Russia has long been seen as one of the world's leading forces in terms of its numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles. And it's true that Russia does have a strong track record in this area, boasting around 5,750 battle tanks total, plus thousands of armoured vehicles